Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Oge Onoborgu, and I'm the director of the Africa program here at the Wilson Center. Thank you all for making the time to be here in person. I know it's a rainy afternoon in Washington, D.C., so we really appreciate those of you who are in the room with us today, and for those who are joining us online as well. Really delighted to host this discussion today with our SVMP scholar, Latifa Namutebi. SVMP stands for the Southern Voices Network for Peacebuilding, which is a program that has been sponsored by the Carnegie Corporation of New York since 2011. The core of the SVMP is to build the next generation of African peace builders through its scholarship program. And we work to create a collaborative Pan-African network of peace-building organizations and practitioners to share knowledge, best practices, and lessons on peace building in Africa. At the core of this program is really to bridge the gap in ensuring that African knowledge and African scholarship informs US policy towards the continent. So really excited that Latifa is here after spending 3 months with us to share her research with us, share some of the findings and key recommendations from the work that she has done, and delighted that we have discussants as well that will be joining her on the panel. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Aaron Stanley, to kick off the conversation and introduce our speakers.
Great, thank you, Oge. And let me also welcome everybody who's joined us in person and those online. My name is, as Oge mentioned, is Aaron Stanley, and I'm a senior program associate here at the Wilson Center Africa program. And I'm particularly glad to have this conversation today and be able to introduce Latifa from our Southern Voices Network for Peacebuilding. Latifa joins us from one of the Southern Voices Network for Peacebuilding members, the Women's International Peace Center in Kampala, Uganda, where she's a strategic partnership and advocacy officer. Latifa leads initiatives that foster democratic development and promote gender-responsive strategies. And while at the Wilson Center, as you'll hear today, Latifa has been focused on the intersections of democratic practices and technology advancement. In addition, I'm very glad to also welcome Maria Kasumbi, Director of Policy and Government Relations at Humanity United, and Jared Ford, Director of Technology and Democracy at the International Republican Institute. Both Maria and Jared will comment on Latifa's work and share their own experiences at the intersection of this space in democracy development and technology. Maria and Jared, thank you so much for joining us on this panel today. And so over the past few months, I've had the opportunity to work closely with Latifa on her research. And what really fascinates me about this work is how she explores a phenomenon that we're seeing across the world. And that phenomenon is a change in the way we interact and communicate, and how technology is really changing those methods and engaging in our day-to-day life. And she's applying that with a nuanced insight about the political systems, culture, and social dynamics in Uganda. And what Latifa presents today is really about this global phenomenon, which allows us to compare and contrast different places and contexts in ways that I believe give us really new insights about how this technology is morphing and changing the way we're interacting as a society and in our politics as well. And so with that, I will just say how it will be structured today is that we'll hand the floor to Latifa, and then we'll have Maria and then Jared as commentators, and then we'll open up for a question and answer. We'll prioritize questions in the room, and we encourage you, particularly with this group, to engage fully, but we'll also, if able to, we'll be able to take questions online as well, and we'll integrate those into the question and answer session. So with that, Latifa.
Thank you, Aaron. Thank you all for coming. So in 2021, the 5-day internet shutdown, it dealt us a heavy blow, and it gave us a time to reflect on what it really meant, engagement And with that shutdown, it wasn't just stopping us from communicating. It impacted the education because we had a lot of people who now moved on to the online teaching because of COVID. We had e-healthcare services, Rocket Health, communications with physicians online. You see businesses were impacted because of the lockdown. Again, people moved their businesses online. And you see they were also impacted. And there's an estimate amount is about $10 million that was cost to our economy. And I don't think that as Uganda we could afford to lose 10 million. However, the shutdown is not something that happened out of the blue. It was something, maybe it was a climax of the locking Facebook, banning it, disrupting communications, and that's 2021. In 2026, social media platforms, as we headed towards the elections again, were shut down, and still not new. 2011 elections, you see disruptions with communications networks and SMS messaging, and the Uganda government has observed Ugandans to overexert themselves, in quotes, during legally commissioned public gatherings like rallies. And let me focus anyway my discussion on the democratic engagement process, which is elections. So during the rallies, Ugandans under the Public Order and Management Act are observed to overexert themselves. And so government has no choice than to stop the rallies from happening anymore because they are seen to be disrupting businesses and public order. And then you see that still, because of the pervasive threat of disinformation, they have no choice but to also turn off the internet or communications, because those are the explanations that we've been getting. And so you see a little bit of control and restriction on our constitutional freedoms of speech, of assembly, of expression. And our media landscape is an evolution, has evolved with, I would say, the nature of democratic engagement that we have had. Because in the 1990s, we had the liberalization of media, and we saw a lot of radio stations, TV, print newspapers, and radio still dominant up to now, and it has more impact because of its reach and accessibility. TV has limitations because of its high production costs, but also the issue with literacy. So now you see that as physical gatherings became increasingly restricted under the Public Order and Management Act and other laws that are relevant, when required, Ugandans start to get creative. So Ebimeza, I'm sure a lot of us have heard of them or not, but they were like people's parliaments, where radio stations would take the discussions into the communities and have live discussions. And you see that by 2009, they are banned, and the reason, not an excuse, because it's a reason from the state, that radio stations had not been given permission to hold live radio talk shows. And yeah, I mean, so you see the public sphere disappearing. But because Ugandans are also unrelenting and very creative, social media begins to rise. You know, by 1998, around 1998, MTN comes in and introduces more access to communications. So after MTN comes in, you see more Worried, Gone Now, or is it Orange? Yeah, so we had internet service providers also coming in. Around the same time, though, we have the Uganda Communications Act that is sort of trying to regulate communication. Like we explained, there's a lot of disinformation with communication. And it seemed that also the media was contributing to this kind of disinformation in a way. There's no data to really show how disinformation from the media was discovered. But so even the media under UCC Act, so now we have social media coming up because we've started to adopt technology and the internet is coming. We have service providers and we create another public sphere, which is Facebook Live sessions. And so by 2011, like I said, the network starts to disappear. I guess sometimes it's also the infrastructure. We have infrastructure challenges. So you can't put it to one thing. It could also be infrastructure. There's limitations. However, we have, as of 2024, we have about 13 million internet users. That's about 27% of our population, and around, I would say 5.7% are using social media actively. So I know you'd think that's a small number compared to the population. However, we shouldn't forget how information moves in our communities. Because I would say, for example, if you get a message and you look at it on Twitter, you take a screenshot, it finds its way into WhatsApp, and when it comes to WhatsApp, the trajectory and speed at which communication will move cannot be traced. However, through that engagement is also a means to verify or debunk that communication. I know the person, I can call them and find out if this tweet is true or not. Or, do you think this is true? No, you can check here and confirm it's true. So even the information always finds itself through in-person interactions because people are discussing, there's telephone calls. Did you see this, online? We have charging stations in communities. And so you're looking at maybe the 2.6 million people that have phones, but that one phone is being used and engaged with more than one person, or even 100 people, say. And democracy stands on pillars of representation, justice, equity, and freedoms. And social media is offering us an opportunity. And I don't want us to focus on the questions of, is it substantial, is it enough? Because now we are becoming defeatist. Because if you're saying that social media if we start to question social media and the role that it plays, it's like we are also deciding that we want to take away our own public sphere. And the public sphere is key in democracy because it provides us a chance, yes, to have the freedom to speak, to question, to have discussions, to look at, sort of take a stock or audit of our leaders and what they are doing, because it's the core for us to be able to have civic engagement and information dissemination, because we have to have informed decision making, which is the voting. But also there has to be ownership of the process that's happening because people feel like they are involved and discussing. In 2021, 59% of the registered voters showed up. And I'm not going to say it's because they turned off the internet, but because of the restrictions with the communication and so many questions and leaving us to wondering. A lot of Ugandans disconnected and detached from the process. They didn't show up. There was a lot of information you see on our traditional media, sort of giving pictures of, there's police, heavy deployment and all that, and there's no explanation. However, the people that know that police is present during elections or polling stations to keep law and order. If the army is present, I would imagine, to help the police to deal with the overexertion of some of the Ugandans. However, it's still not something that was communicated properly, but because now, internet is completely off, some phone calls were disrupted, they couldn't go through. Maybe if you're lucky, one or two calls go through. So we were left in the dark. We had so many questions, and they were left unanswered, someone answered. And so you see what happens when people don't have access to information or a chance to. There's so many questions. You're left in a state of not knowing or uncertainty, which is not good if we are looking at the key aspect of informed decision-making come election day, because elections are a very big part of democracy, because that's where the representation comes from. That's how you choose your leaders, who will determine whether you will have human development, whether you will have other pillars of democracy like freedoms, whether there will be justice or equity. And so the Women's International Peace Center has documented how disconnection for democratic processes can lead to serious consequences. So the report is Election-Related Conflict and Violence in Uganda, published in 2020. And it shows how information vacuums during elections can spark rumors of electoral malpractice, leading to violence. And I'll take us to 2016 elections, where there was limited information, uncertainty, and so you leave space for rumors of vote rigging, ballot tampering, and when that happens, some people are not, you see those long lines. I don't know if you've had a chance to see how we vote. There's those long lines and the hot sun, and so you start to question, why are we even here? Then the other people are like, no, since this thing has been rigged, we might as well just top everything, and then there's the chaos. And because, like I mentioned, there's the army, and they came prepared to deal with that, to support the police in keeping law and order. Sometimes the interactions go quickly from trying to stop a small disagreement into, I don't want to alarm anyone, but sometimes, if you're not used to tear gas sound, sometimes it can sound like something else, and that can be scary sometimes. And that growing feeling of fear and tension that keeps building is not something we want in our country, because we are proud. We walk around the region and say that we have been able to keep the violence and conflict in the region out of Uganda, and Uganda is a good marker for peace and peace building. Hopefully soon we'll have a national peace building policy. And so right now, 2024, we have this opportunity, because like I explained, as we take time to teach Ugandans how to behave during public rallies, I hope that the Electoral Commission will be able to come out this time and use social media as well to tell us how we should behave, give us clear guidelines. Because yes, social media is good, but still there's some people who do not have access. Like I mentioned, we have infrastructure challenges, but also literacy. We don't want the last man standing, last woman, to miss out on information just because Ugandans do not know how to behave, or we have not been properly guided on how to behave during campaigns. I had the opportunity to witness a rally. The sense of security and the excitement to go and see your candidate and just be around people, and you're just together, and it's not, I think it's a good thing So I hope come 2026, because now we have the whole of 2025 to prepare. And right now what's happening is that we have civic engagement. You see it with the hashtags, Stop Corruption. In 2021, we had the UG Decides, Uganda Decides, Stop Police Brutality, because like I mentioned, there was a lot of clashes between the civilians and the police, misunderstandings. And so I feel like if we take advantage of the opportunity of the 78% of the young people who are involved in Uganda and the biggest percentage who are involved online, to provide information on time and have discussions. And beyond that, also start peace messaging, peaceful coexistence. But most importantly, there has to be information, not just from individuals, but also from the government itself, from the Electoral Commission. We want to hear from the Uganda Communications Commission. We want to hear from Anita Uganda. How are they all coming together to ensure that the social media space that we have that's allowing for activism, and because we had the Uganda Parliamentary Exhibition, which was a very good opportunity for us to sort of audit our leaders. Because again, like I said, if we don't have the chance to be able to know what you're doing or what you're not doing, we're not able to make the right decision. Or remind you that you promised this, and while we see that time is running out, you need to get back on track, on the promises you made in your constituencies, or hold them accountable to the promises they made that they've not fulfilled. So you see how we are trying to organize as young people online, although it's not substantial in a way that satisfies. I don't want to say that there should be a clear way in how we define and describe for people how they should communicate or how we consume information and knowledge, because it's changed. Take, for example, TikTok. No one is going to watch your 1-minute video. I mean, do it in 15 seconds and we are moving on. And you see with Instagram, maybe I'm not in the mood to read something, so show me a picture. Maybe I have time, I'm doing something and I want to engage in a discussion, so I'm on an X space or I'm watching YouTube live. So there needs to be guidelines on how we engage, but also most importantly, managing information movement and not taking for granted the cycles and trajectory of our information and focusing on the disinformation, so that we are able to preserve our digital sphere, which is social media. And beyond just that, I should be able to wake up and watch my TikToks. If I'm even on election day, even if I'm not going to vote. In Uganda, there's people who are not registered voters. We are one of the largest hosts of refugees. So we have people in Uganda who are not registered voters, and they have to stay in touch with their relatives, with their family, and you're turning off internet. So I think it's no longer an option that we have. It's just finding a way in how we manage it, and we have 2025 to do it. We have 2025 to work with the Women's Situation Room in Uganda to see how to do proper peace messaging, but also peace building, starting from the communities all the way up to the leadership of the elections, but also our leaders. And yeah, I think I'll conclude and emphasize my point, which I hope did not get lost in my whole conversation, that social media is more than just a platform for us to communicate. And even if it's just a platform for us to watch jokes and all that, it's still fine, because that is my right, it's my freedom provided to me by the Constitution. But I'm saying that we shouldn't take it away, because we don't want to have information gaps and people disconnecting and then quickly going from that to violence. We don't want that. And yeah, so social media right now transcends its role as a communication medium. And it's our public sphere. It's how we have information now. It's how we communicate. It's how we are getting citizens engaged. And thank you.
Thank you, Latifa. Latifa, you've provided a lot of food for thought for us, and touched on a lot of themes, and I think it's very interesting to think about the role that social media plays in touching on so many of these aspects of not only of a specific aspect of a political process, like an election, but how it goes beyond that, and how it now is playing a role in our public sphere. And in particular, I think some of the information that you've provided here, but will also be in your research brief when that's published very soon, is that how it connects into some of the social dynamics in Uganda. You noted some of the statistics about who has internet access, who has phone access, and how some of the congregation within communities around either charging stations or around even online platforms like WhatsApp and the communication tools there are all contributing to a very developing and unique kind of scenario of information transfer, both very positive communication as well as some opportunities for disinformation, which obviously then go into some of your points around the opportunities for violence and how that combines with other aspects of the political dynamics. So thank you very much for that, Latifa. With that, I want to now turn over to Maria and really reflect on some of the themes that Latifa has been able to share with us within your own work and your own experiences.
No, thank you, Aaron, and thank you, Latifa. Thank you, Aaron, and thank you, Latifa, for this very, very good, timely presentation at this time when we are preparing for elections in Uganda for 2026. I think I will build on your point where you're talking about the importance of preserving Uganda's digital sphere. Because I say it's very, very important right now. If we look at Uganda currently right now, Uganda has never had a peaceful transfer of power. Majority of the youth, they say youth starts 18 and ends 35, have only seen one president. We have a very restrictive civic space in Uganda. The other day I was reading a leading headline where they say the NGO sector has collapsed. We have an opposition that is divided and deep in internal struggles. The elites space, we have a very restrictive space where there's no avenue for citizens to protest or to even get on the streets. We have preventive arrests happening. Even before you get out of your house, you're arrested. We have a very blurry separation of powers. So why I list this out is because I'm showing you in spaces where there's no civic engagement and citizen engagement, for citizens' voices to be heard, there's tendency for violence to happen. We saw what happened in Sudan. So it's important to also take into consideration the history and the context of Uganda and why the avenue and space of social media is super important, because it creates that citizen engagement, it creates that space for transparency, and it creates that space for accountability. Latifa, you mentioned the exhibition. So there've been social media exhibitions whereby they're highlighting issues within the country. I think the first one was on the potholes. So there are very many potholes in Kampala. And it was very fascinating to see people from all walks of life, not only the political elite, but the youth, the young, across different political parties coming together and highlighting that this is an issue, this is a problem. And it was a good way of showing how citizens were expressing their frustration and their voice was being heard. If you go to Kampala right now, it's now a construction city because they are trying to fix the roads. And I feel like this was some of the outcomes of that pothole exhibition, where citizens were like, we are tired of this, we need something to be done. The other exhibition, I just wanted to highlight and just bring out as to why it creates those spaces for citizen engagement. The other one was the Parliament exhibition that you mentioned, where it highlighted a lot of the corruption that is happening within the Parliament. I love that it was not a political discussion, it was a citizen discussion, whereby citizens were very frustrated and angry with the level of corruption happening. And it was also very good for the citizens to have an eye of what's happening within your political process or your parliament, and what is it that needs to be done. It created a kind of pressure whereby now you had members of parliament trying to go on in rallies to try and justify some of the actions that they are doing within parliament. So I felt like social media opened the door for an ordinary citizen to be able to see what is happening in your parliament and how can you contribute to push to change that. The other is it also created a lot of diversity. It wasn't something which was hijacked by different political parties. Even because I was in Kampala for 3 months a couple months ago, you even have people from borders, the bicycle people, talking about discussions which you feel like are only had in these elitist spaces. So it took a discussion which is only in these small spaces to an ordinary citizen. What we saw in that exhibition was accountability, transparency, and I think it also created a pressure and momentum within the ministries and the government, the ministries, to try and also share and be transparent of the work that they're doing on how they're also trying to address some of the issues that the citizens had raised in these exhibitions. And then I'll also talk about the recent one around, there was a landfill which happened in Chitezi where we had about 30 people who actually died. And the citizen was enraged. Citizens were enraged, like, how does this happen? Debates were had on social media, on X space, where people were sharing the stories and their frustration. And it was able to create a pressure whereby now all eyes are on the body in charge of landfills within the city, and the president having action and firing these leaders, which it's small little wins, but at least you can see the pressure that these spaces create and have voiced citizens feel like we are heard, there's transparency, and then there's accountability. So when I talk about now how social media is super important in the election period is, you mentioned, I think about 50% turned up for elections in 2021. If I remember the numbers, 18 million were registered to vote. Only 10 million voted, and 8 million did not vote. Yet they were registered to vote. So you ask yourself, what does that mean? And that's where we could see how do you engage social media to build back the trust into the electoral processes, to ensure that citizens are feeling heard and listened and feel like their voice, because the election is a tool that one can be able to express their voice on the kind of leaders that they need. So is social media a space that we could be able to foster that trust, restore that trust for those 8 million who did not show up to vote, to be able to vote. But in addition to that, of the role of social media and how we could use it to build trust in the electoral process is, I will start with, I'm a lawyer, so of course I'll start with the Constitution. I should have started that with the first thing. The 1995 Constitution, I think in hopes of restoring trust in the electoral process, we need to restore the term limits within the Constitution. We also need to look at the role of the military in elections, and I think you mentioned how the military was showing up within the polls. And then also, I think it's also important, the Electoral Commission. Is there trust in the Electoral Commission in holding these elections? Do we need to reform the Electoral Commission and ensure it's a citizen-led electoral process where citizens are identifying who is joining the Electoral Commission, and it's not only a mandate of the executive of the state, but then more citizens deciding who they want to join in the Electoral Commission, citizens having a voice in joining the Judicial Service Commission. I'm very proud of Uganda Law Society opening up space so that members who are going to join the Judicial Service Commission campaign within the electoral process. And I think if you talk about the role of social media, you look at the actions of the Uganda Law Society is now open for the public. Everyone now knows what is happening in Uganda Law Society. Everyone knows that elections are going to be happening on that. So it creates that citizen engagement and a lot of transparency. So if we talk about restoring that trust, if we have citizens engaged in deciding who is within the Electoral Commission, who is within the Judicial Commission, I believe that we'll be able to restore that trust within the electoral system, and it will be important for the social media role to be preserved. So I think going forward, we need to protect that space, ensure that there's legislation and policies which protect that space, protect those whistleblowers who come on social media to report this. We also need to look at expanding who has access to social media, the role that the diaspora can be able to play to elevate the movements or the hashtags that are happening. Yeah, so I think, have I talked too much? Okay, yeah.
Oh, that's fantastic. Thank you, Maria, for that. I think you've brought up a lot of really interesting points. I think this question about the role that of trust in the system and the role that social media plays as a piece of that as well. And I think that segues nicely to you, Jared, and discussing and looking a little bit more broadly, not just at Uganda, but how these different themes that Latifa and Maria as well have brought up about the use of social media and how it integrates into both election processes, as well as kind of the more around kind of the citizen government interaction, and how you've seen that through your experiences and your work.
Thank you, Aaron. Thanks for the introduction. Thank you to Oge and the Wilson Center for this chance to participate in a lively and interesting discussion. Thank you to Latifa for the great research. Had a chance to take a look at the first draft, and Maria for your insights on Uganda and peacebuilding. So my name is Jared Ford. I sit at IRI, a nonprofit advancing democracy and freedom globally. And I sit on their technology and democracy team. So I think most of the context for my remarks today will have a global focus. For more Uganda-centric specifics, I'll refer you to my Africa Division colleagues, which I'm happy to put you in touch with. But I think the work that Latifa has done does raise up some global themes that we are seeing across the technology and democracy portfolio, with specific examples from Uganda. But I did want to take a step back and sort of raise up these frameworks, which I think are relevant as we try to apply lessons learned across countries, in peer-to-peer nations, and across a variety of political regimes. So I think the consensus, hopefully, of this room and in our broader community is that digital technologies, and dominated by social media, have had a disproportionate impact on our democratic society. So we're definitely seeing it evolve our economic systems, our healthcare systems, the private sector, but democracy and democratic institutions are no exception in that place. It's both a nuanced and complex influence that digital technologies have had. So Latifa raised up both the opportunities, and I think it's important to focus on those opportunities in order to inspire and motivate, but also to recognize the threats and the risks associated with the digitization of our democracies and our democratic institutions. In terms of those opportunities, both Latifa and Maria have highlighted improvements or abilities for more people to be involved in civic participation. So actual policy-focused conversations, political conversations, feedback on policy, organizing locally. These new platforms have created spaces where citizens can enable greater fundamental freedoms associated with participating in a democratic society. We've also seen many initiatives over the last 10 or so years associated with increased transparency, and then linking that increased transparency to accountability. So governments have been leaders in this space, as well as civil society organizations, platforming government data, sharing how processes within political systems work, monitoring groups actually raising up evidence about political processes then lets other actors get involved at the pressure points in those processes and hopefully move towards more democratic systems. Staying on the positive sides of things, access to information. So understanding candidate profiles, candidate positions, understanding government resources, understanding what other actors are doing within your community, within your country, or regionally empowers more and more people. I will also highlight government service delivery here. So we're highly focused on citizens, but democratic institutions working and using digital technologies to actually be more effective enhances democratic outcomes from my perspective. So the more that traffic agencies, the more that local resources to fill potholes are done digitally, reporting is done digitally, tracking is done digitally, and hopefully that turns out to better service delivery. Ideally, in many places, that means enhanced democratic success. Beyond those examples, and I'm forgetting to mention advocacy initiatives, mobilization initiatives, I did want to highlight a lot of the threats associated with our lives being digital, because activists, folks in Uganda, folks in the region, folks globally need to be aware of them and then defend themselves against them. So some of these examples came out in Latifa's paper. First of all, surveillance has been supercharged. An erosion of privacy is occurring across the board. So activists, governments, technology firms all have a role to play in ensuring that our increasing datafication of our lives isn't used to target, to oppress, to repress, and to share that information, but in fact we're raising up privacy values and we're protecting citizen data online. So surveillance and privacy is a critical competitive area. We're also seeing in many places the enablement of censorship, both by technology firms and governments, and by citizens through self-censorship. So the more that our conversations are happening in spaces that we don't own, in spaces that are governed by global companies, in spaces that are regulated at international levels and national levels, that means we're losing some of our power to access information and to control our speech and our ability to assemble. So recognizing that assembly and threats surrounding censorship is a risk that we need to battle in the digital space is important. You've heard mention here of information integrity, trust, really information manipulation across the board. Honestly, in democratic spaces, in closing spaces, that is a real focus of the democracy assistance community. So recognizing that misinformation is pretty widespread. Disinformation, meaning motivated misinformation with a political goal, information manipulation, propaganda. These, unfortunately, are all elements and trends that are accelerated and enabled by social media, digital technologies, and we could look forward to emerging technologies. So generative AI is something our organization, our team is anticipating is going to have a profound effect in each of these spaces. We're also seeing threats associated with the digital divide. So you've heard my colleagues reference who has access. Marginalized communities that are offline are now farther and farther away from voice, power. But then if the assumption is that citizens are online, then when that assumption isn't met, you are further marginalizing and discriminating and biasing communities who don't have that access. So I wanted to highlight both the positives and the weaknesses. In terms of what are some lessons learned or best practices for civil society organizations that may be most represented in this conversation, but honestly, I'm happy to speak to the role of technology firms, the role of governments in trying to empower democratic institutions using digital technologies. I want to raise up a couple of principles or values that are really cross-cutting all of these stakeholder groups rather than specific examples, but happy to follow up later with specific examples. One is whenever one is developing new technology or technological system, deploying it and using it, keeping in mind how to make these processes open and transparent ensures that there's a lot more awareness and understanding as to why decisions are made and why certain impacts occur. So for technology companies, when content is algorithmically amplified in certain geographies, it's important for tech firms to actually be a lot more open and share more information as to how their platforms work so that activists can make better decisions. When governments are deploying data collection systems, service delivery systems, actually sharing with citizens how the system works, what information is being collected on them, how they can engage and update that information. Anytime you're engaging with citizens in these processes, emphasizing transparency and openness is important. Another value set I would want to raise up, and you can see this across digital principles around development, around democracy assistance, around donor communities, is anticipating and then mitigating risks. So it's not enough to just deploy technology and hope for the best or ignore the impacts on certain marginalized communities, but to actually be proactive in investigating what those impacts look like. So that means putting decision makers from marginalized communities into the room. That means rolling out and deploying systems in incremental ways so you can evaluate those risks. That means recognizing that instead of just economic incentives or market-based incentives, there should be, and there needs to be movements for, human rights incentives and democracy incentives. So actually having assessments associated with human rights impacts, democracy impacts, associated with social media decision-making, digital technology decision-making would be highly valued. One of the last things I'll leave you with is ensuring that the systems that we're implementing are people-led, so that you make sure not only when you're sharing data and you're making decisions around data in these systems that people are involved in the process, but that there is a feedback loop that ensures after a period of time, when impacts are more apparent, future decisions can be made to improve the democratic decisions and outcomes with those systems. So happy to highlight other principles, but those are really best practices associated with trying to ensure a democratic digital ecosystem. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jared. We really appreciate that. And I think that there's some obvious overlaps in a lot of these conversations and the opportunities, but also looking at some of the threats. And often those are very often kind of one and the same, actually, or two sides of the same coin. And I think we can get into some of those in the question and answer. So I'd like to start to open it up. If there are immediate questions, we can start to take those. Otherwise, I can begin with the moderator's prerogative and give a question to Latifa. So as you're, it looks like that, as you're formulating some questions, we'll start with one to Latifa. Latifa, in your presentation, you really spoke about some of this kind of opportunity and threat of providing more information and more access to information that can be done through social media, but also that there's this element of misinformation or disinformation. And in your presentation, you have a higher level of confidence than most that there's systems within place in Ugandan society that help to navigate misinformation and help to kind of work through that in a more community way. Can you just describe that a little bit more and speak to us about why you're more confident that that's a strong way of kind of addressing some of the misinformation that is being shared online?
Thank you. We underestimate the power of existing with others. and not living in isolation, but living as a community where you share information. I'm here, but I know every single thing that happens at home, sometimes even before other people in the house. And I feel like if you apply that just to the country, you see it. By the time you see information from print media in a different format from the original source, because also, like I explained, media also was misbehaving. And so they had to give them strict guidelines. So they are not able to behave as they used to in the 1990s. So if we look at, say, okay, something, a tweet, with that information, that tweet is not going to stay on Twitter. Never. It's never happened. It will get screenshotted. And with WhatsApp, like I explained, we don't have the data. I hope Meta is ready to give us some statistics on how information moves, like the speed, the scalability of information. How fast can something move? So once it finds itself in groups, it's getting shared everywhere. And earlier on, we were talking about the diaspora and how so much, because when you leave home, when you're at home, you're not really on your phone because you know someone is going to find a way to give you the information. Like I mentioned, it will get itself offline and find the people. It will get to people. And so you have here, you rely more on information using your device. And so you even find that the information will move to the diaspora. Even then, it's not going to take on its own face or come back. You know how they say, if I tell you something and tell it to your neighbor, by the time it comes back to you, it will be different. That's not what happens. It happens as the information moves, but even then as it moves, it will get debunked or verified. Because at every one point, the information is going to leave the online place where, if it's false information, for example, how people like to communicate, like they're communicating to screens. Once I start to repeat that information as a person, you can see that it doesn't sound how it is or it's not right. And so I know that we have the networks and the communities to be able to deal with this, especially disinformation, because you can tell someone, you can see the malice and the lies and the intentionality. And actually, because of our community debunking, I would say that's why we don't have Facebook anymore. Because we were able to debunk the bots, because in Uganda, you know everyone. So if a bot is tweeting, you say, but who has been able to speak to this person? No one. That's a bot. And so the fears of the bots, okay, now we have the deep fake and the AI is creating falsifying people's voices or actions. And that's used a lot with technology-facilitated gender-based violence, which should be a discussion of its own. It needs its own year or month or some, right? But so we are a community. You are not going to find a community of people who talk to one another and think that your lies are going to spread so fast and influence them. Actually, your lies can work if you restrict the way, like I mentioned, how we communicate and find each other. So if you restrict our movements, and then, wait, I don't want to give anyone ideas. I will not add anything, because I realize I might be giving people ideas.
Well, thank you, Latifa. And I've given everybody in the room a little time, and you have as well, to think through a few additional questions. We have one question from online as well, but we'll take a few right now. Over here.
Well, thank you so very much. I wanted to begin by just trying to get a sense from Latifa about motivation. I've not been told enough about the motivation. I can guess certain things, but of government, why does it shut down the internet as elections approach? Now, I chair the board of organization called Paradigm Initiative. They are probably active in Uganda also, Africa-wide digital integrity group. But there is a motive that the government has. Usually it's to prevent certain kinds of people from organizing so that they, but I don't know. That's why I want to find out from you. What do you think is the key motive for, is it fear of general disinformation? Is it because people may organize better and therefore vote in a direction that the authorities don't want them to? That a sense for that would be very helpful. But I was also quite fascinated by the idea of exhibition on potholes. Again, many years ago, there was an Africa-wide NGO that we tried to start, Jim Abuadi, myself, and a couple of called Good Governance Africa. We actually wanted to develop potholes index, this index, and we would use it to push for accountability. I wonder how well you're dealing with things like potholes and stuff have emerged and developed into something that you can use to hold people accountable, because it would be a good learning point if one can see how well. Just finally, traditionally, the media created great images, what in media research they call status conferral function of the media. You show up on television, you're a newscaster, you become a person, you become an influencer, as they say in the social media space. And somehow they influence the multi-step flow of communication, and you can tell that it's not exactly the way the news was broadcast that people act, because what's the role of influencers in the digital space in terms of voting behavior? And could that be part of the fear of governments in terms of wanting to capture or regulate that space? Let me just stop there.
Thanks very much. We'll take one more question here, and then I'll read our online question, and then we'll have time for to continue around the room.
My name is Angela Judah Debanjuku. I'm a fellow with the African program. My worry is about how you can keep this space, because from what you have discussed so far, what is open to the Ugandan people now is just the social media. And the truth is that the social media has come to stay as far as elections are concerned. If you look at the election in Nigeria in 2023, it was the social media that brought up the third force. The Ugandan election you talked about in 2021 also. But my worry is that today people feel that because we have free speech, I have the right to say what I want to say, and the rest of them, there's this kind of a lack of restriction in terms of how people talk. Now, you see that somebody sends a tweet, and then I know the social media, when you look at the number, it's made up of predominantly young people. People go about, they insult people and the rest. Maybe as an African, I feel it. Sometimes I read and I'm worried, I'm disturbed. Because at the end of the day, the government clamps down on the social media and we say the government has shut, because it happened in Nigeria in sometime in the past. So my question is, among yourself, because you have a way of communicating with one another, how do you ensure that this space is not closed? Because something could happen. And at the end of the day, the government does something, and what we see is what the government has done and not what the people are doing. So how do you, maybe from your interactions, okay, you talk to yourselves, this is what we have now, this is the only way now we can express ourselves. How do you tell one another? How do you kind of ensure that this space, at the end of the day, is not closed? Because I've even read that women, like you said, that's another research entirely. Women are being trolled on the social media. There's violence against women, and many of them are not even on Twitter. Many of the political candidates, women. So how do they get to, Ghana votes and the rest of them? because of the fear of being trolled and the like. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We will come around for another round of questions. I'm going to read one more from online, and then we'll have quite a set here. And I encourage the entire panel to jump into this conversation and really engage with your own experiences in the areas that you're working. So this question from online says, regarding community building and engagement, how can social media facilitate dialogue and understanding among different communities to prevent electoral violence? So I'll leave that one. In addition to, we have Professor Tomei gave us 3 questions, and all very strong, and on the motives of shutting down, speaking more to the motives of shutting down, maybe both in the Ugandan context, but also if those of you have experience in other contexts with shutdowns, discussing the potential of a potholes index, but the question behind that really looking at some of what's being discussed around that, and then the changing influencers and how that's impacting both the online engagement as well as voting behavior, and then from Angela as well on how can you keep this space open, and what's kind of this role of not letting it be closed, but allowing it to be a very interactive and healthy space. Latifa, perhaps we'll start with you, and then we'll let Maria and Jared come in with their thoughts.
So I'll go through it quickly so Maria can also add. In terms of motivation, from the information that I have, is that the government has observed Ugandans to, like I explained, they overexert themselves during political engagements, and online also they like to spread false information. And when it comes to the physical spaces, they disrupt public order. That's according to the government's observations. And so there is no choice, because I imagine in that quick moment, they have to take the fastest option available, which is to stop a lawfully accepted gathering, or to turn off the internet to manage the spread of disinformation. And then when it comes to the influencers, well, it's twofold, because some influencers are not even engaging with the politics at all. And when they engage with the politics, it's because they have been, unfortunately, hired, paid. They're doing it for money. And also that also comes because social media platforms don't want to pay also Ugandan creators their worth. And however, some of these influencers are trained media personnel, actually. And unfortunately, they still do not abide by the journalistic rules. And you find that they are communicating in a way that's more careless than careful. And so they also start to amplify, I guess, the disinformation or misinformation. And so how do we keep the place, the space open? Digital literacy. Timely information sharing, especially from the government and the bodies, because people have questions, they're not being answered. We need guidelines on political campaigning and use of social media for political campaigning, because we don't have those guidelines. And if there's no guidelines, we don't know the line, the limit. And like I explained, right now, the reasons we lose these spaces is because of our misbehavior. So while we can take steps on our end, we also need our leadership to come in and take steps on their end to be able to harmonize. So we find equilibrium instead of continuous pushback. For example, Meta, X, YouTube, TikTok, they have guidelines for political campaigning and political communication, where all political candidates or political party pages are taken through some means of verification, which is not the case in Uganda. That content is not labeled. But also the gap is the language issue. So a lot of that communication might get through get away with it because it's not being done in English. Yeah. So how do we, you said, how do we remain connected to communicate with one another? Well, even when they're still giving people ideas, I think maybe we can have a discussion after the public event on that. And so, Maria, Jared, do you have?
Yeah, I think I don't speak for the government. I think we could recognize our ambassador here. We could maybe, Ambassador Uganda here to DC, to maybe mention more on why government shuts down the internet. But the little that I know is misinformation is the reason as to why they shut it down, and it has potential to create violence. So maybe I will yield my voice for you, Ambassador.
Thank you very much. Mine is to thank the Wilson Center and also to request for an opportunity for government and other stakeholders to have their own panel where they can really present their information in their context. I think it would not be in my position at the moment it would not be fair in the information that I would give to you. But now that I have the mic, I want to thank the Wilson Center. And I would also like to follow up with the other lady's question. In what we have seen in other countries, in that some of that information, and more so on social media, there's a tendency when it draws across sometimes racial lines, and that's especially even in elections. And we have got to also note that in government, there are incidences where some of these messagings and on social media, those lines are tribal lines, and sometimes they invoke, other sentiments, and it's a way of saying how do you begin to have this conversation in this space and to increase it, because again this whole beast or burden or of social media that has come to be there for what it's worth. When you look at the traditional media that we had, even then, young people really didn't have the space to express themselves, because many times it was in the newspapers, and not many young people could afford newspapers. And also, if you look at the circulation of the newspapers, then maybe you had like publishing 10,000 copies, so how were people getting that information? So that's why for a long time, the government really took it upon itself to use radio as the biggest medium, so that you can get this information on health and education, and also to get the politicians engaged and to see what sort of information is there. But what we're dealing with now is a reverse pyramid, where that information, there's more information on top than at the bottom. Because the other way around, it used to be you had the editor, then you had the sub-editor, then you had this picture that was worth 1,000 words, one picture that many people were looking at. But now with social media, you get that one picture and you just have different people cropping it and looking at it in a certain way, in that by the time, it reminds me of that game telephone, where if we were here and each of us, and I said something to you, by the time it came back to me, it certainly would not be, the chances are that it may not be the thing, but I won't take up too much space other than to thank the Wilson Center, and more so the Africa program, for this opportunity, and to just to request to, if we reach out to have government and other stakeholders continue this engagement. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Ambassador. I'd also like Jared to give you an opportunity to respond to a few of these questions, and then we'll come back to the audience.
Yeah, thank you very much. Excellent questions, variety of topics. I'm going to try to do rapid fire on as many of these as I can touch. I think the pothole index, I'll start there. Sort of the civic tech movement, where sort of citizen reporting systems and sometimes government reporting systems use digital technology and empower citizens to have better access, definitely had a heyday maybe 12 to 15 years ago. And it really, I think, moved to either success or failure based on local contexts and the power dynamics and ability for government to actually meet those demands. So if you have a map that shows a set of government service delivery needs that are not being met, at some point folks don't post there anymore, and or subnational governments, national governments don't engage with that system because there's no incentive to improve their reputation and to integrate it into their services. So you really need this cross-sectoral collaboration of what are the government service units that are expected to deliver, filling potholes, fixing water tanks, setting up bike lanes, and is there a benefit to strengthen their unit in engaging with citizens? So unless you have some of those incentives aligned properly, oftentimes these digital platforms might be initially used, but get put to the side. There was a question on the role of influencers. The way I see that in a lot of contexts is actually the loss of capacity and trust in institutions. So a lot of citizens used to go to newspapers, mass media, TV stations, government ministries, lead civil society organizations as honestly, as previous influencers, folks who had experience, folks whose voice mattered, folks who had evidence that they could rely on. And I think over time, there are probably a variety of trends associated with polarization, media echo chambers. So there are a variety of reasons why new stakeholders and voices have arisen as experts, as where individuals go and get their information. So how do we actually get better data into the hands of citizens? How do we change this trust dynamic? One recommendation we often make, and we see some experienced either government actors or civil society actors moving towards, is becoming influencers themselves. So you have to adopt techniques of being in platforms where citizens are. You have to change how you talk about issues, the 1 minute versus 15-second sound bites. But institutions need to recognize that the media landscape has changed, and if you don't evolve with those changes, then you are going to get a lot less respect than influencers, and you're going to lose the share of the information ecosystem you have. So I think engaging in that space as a credible actor would be what IRI would recommend. In terms of opening space for dialogue in social media platforms, it's a very difficult situation out there. So technology facilitated gender-based violence, the predominance of bots, the predominance of synthetic media. It is not easy to break through on existing platforms. We're also seeing the lack of regulation globally, the lack of regulation in nation states, creating a space where democratic dialogue and truth and factual information is not privileged on these platforms. So honestly, where I think the unique opportunities are alternative spaces, are new platforms. So you're seeing, at least with X and Twitter, a lot of users are moving to platforms that are promising, and this promise has not been fulfilled yet, but promising to prioritize civic integrity, truth, trust and safety on those spaces. So existing platforms have actually backed away from some of these commitments. So a more competitive information ecosystem or landscape might actually create spaces for better dialogue. There are also techniques around deliberative technologies where you create a safe space. Folks are either identified or not identified depending on the needs. But then there are a whole set of rules of engagement that then move towards more substantive conversations. So I don't think it's easy on existing platforms right now to have deliberative dialogue, but hopefully as activists can influence global conversations, global norms, existing platforms will improve, but then alternative platforms will rise up and create this market-based pressure to improve democratic spaces online.
Great, thank you very much. So I think I saw two other hands before we moved. So we'll go one and then two. Akashi.
All right. Thank you very much, and Latifa, congratulations on this very beautiful presentation. I think it's a very stimulating one, and I'm just wondering if you could just talk more about, or rather just give us some information about the methodology you used in gathering your sources, for the presentation. That is the first one. Then the second, I'm just wondering about what happened in your neighboring country, Kenya, just recently, and what lessons that you in Uganda could have drawn from such an experience, the young people coming up and standing up for their rights. And then lastly, Oge had mentioned that this program is all about informing U.S. policy and reform. Are there recommendations that you have that we could learn from? Thank you.
Great, thank you. And then we had a question in the back.
Yes. Good afternoon. My name is Karim. I do advocacy and strategic outreach for National Unity Platform in the diaspora. I'm interested in how we can hold government accountable on propaganda, because hearing from Latifa, it's like social media was shut down because people were doing misinformation. Unfortunately, that's not what the record shows according to us, because in the run-up to the elections, you remember, Twitter had to shut down 600 accounts that were attached to the Ugandan government that were spreading propaganda. Facebook shut down 2,000 accounts that were also associated with government of Uganda. But we don't have any of, the marginalized people's accounts that were, spreading propaganda. The other thing is, if we are to blame the victims and we don't look at the situation under which these elections were carried out, the most violent, where over 3,000 campaign agents for the opposition were roughed up and abducted, you're looking at a major opposition candidate campaigning wearing a flat jacket because government is shooting all over the place. You're looking at a campaign which was as violent to the extent that between November 18th to the 20th, over 100 people were killed. Now, major media houses would not report that. People had to resort to social media, and government didn't want all this information to come out. So what did they do? First, government introduces a tax on social media. Second, as if that was not enough, they would have to shut down, internet completely. And unfortunately, when it comes to things like Facebook, which has been shut down for the past 4 years, we have been seeing government officials also using VPN to communicate officially on a platform that was, cancelled. So I'm trying to wonder, how do we level the playing field of communication, and how do we hold government accountable for propaganda and misinformation? Thank you.
Thank you for those questions. Just to give the chance, if anyone else has a question in the group that they would like to, otherwise we'll give it to our panelists for one final round. Okay. Yes, Ambassador.
I wanted to, you said there is no policy in terms of campaigns? Did you mean like there's no social media policy for the campaigns?
Guidelines
Oh,
of.
guidelines? Okay, because I think that's a conversation that could be had with the Electoral Commission. I want something positive to come on, positive and actionable to come out of this meeting. So that one you can put me to task to follow up. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. I'll begin with my recommendations. And yes, actually, the election and communication regulators, because it's a team effort. And we are saying that there is a 2026 election roadmap that is expected, and it's an opportunity to include clear guidelines for political campaigning on social media and also voter education initiatives with timely, accurate dissemination of election-related information, so that we are not speculating or guessing. We know if we want information, we go to the Electoral Commission's pages and we'll find it. And the Uganda Communications Commission should also provide guidelines, because at the end of the day, because internet is provided by telecommunication companies, sort of they have oversight or control of social media in that way. So they need to come on board to support the Electoral Commission. And then also the National Information Technology Authority, that's responsible for data protection and privacy, because social media means data protection, people's data and all that. So we need to come together, establish a digital election integrity task force within the next 4 months, so quickly, to develop and implement a comprehensive framework for monitoring and regulating social media use during election periods. And we can borrow key elements from the European Union's Code of Practice on Disinformation, looking at transparency in reporting and collaborating with platforms and everyone who, like civil society organizations, on fact-checking, because some of it, there was PesaCheck which tried to do something in 2021, especially when the internet was off. There were those pictures of showing as if police was taking away ballot boxes, and there was something. But there should also be a long-term goal for creating independent oversight. And this one includes bringing everyone on board: civil society, the regulators mentioned, private sector, yeah, because we have the money. And in terms of the platforms, again, the Electoral Commission can work with the social media platforms, because I know Meta has guidelines for political ads and page verification. X has as well. TikTok has government, politician, and political party accounts guidelines. And they ensure that political candidates and political party accounts are verified, they are validated, and so their communication is marked as political communication, so it is clear. And also I will know that if I want information from this, I will go to this. If I see information it's not directly from this page, I know that it's not authentic information. Same as YouTube. Yeah. Then for the US policymakers, I know they give us a lot of aid in Uganda, which we are very grateful for. However, some of that aid should be focused specifically on a digital democracy innovation fund. And I know, again, that the US has partners, civil society partners. They mentioned about, in their last report, the US mission to Uganda's last report, 2023, they mentioned they had about 100 plus civil societies in Uganda partners spread across 146 districts. So those are opportunities to support the public awareness campaigns, but also complementing those efforts with Ugandan youth and empowering the leaders, the bloggers, the content creators with the skills to use platforms responsibly. And also, US can facilitate the dialogue with the platforms, because I mentioned that our first point of contact with some of these platforms was not on a positive note. And so the US can try and start those conversations so that we can go ahead, because like I mentioned, our task force is going to be established in 4 months and they'll be ready to go. Yeah, and also we need infrastructure, because we need more people online. Because the more of us that are online, the more we'll be able to question these things and challenge. Because like I mentioned, in Uganda, for us, our challenge is disinformation, which we manage in our own way, but also we don't have the scale and the speed of the internet. Either way, a border is not going to get, even if I get on a border to take gossip to my sister, I'm not going to get there before WhatsApp. So, because a border is the fastest after a car. So, yeah. Those are my recommendations. My methodology, I focused on secondary data, literature reviews. I had a few interviews, and the purpose of the interviews was to, actually I realized during the interviews if I was creating my own echo chamber, because you were reaching out to people who share your same ideologies. And we talked about how those thrive in disinformation, but yeah, so if you look at that, actually, echo chambers are circles of connectivity, so we decide what we want those circles to focus on. But again, back to my methodology is I focus on secondary data. So news articles, internet, Google, and then I also had interviews with a few experts in the field, and the purpose of the interviews was to give me clear pictures and understandings, and analyzing the issues better, having better argument, but also to provide broader perspectives, to put the Ugandan context into a bigger, broader perspective. Yes, and they are all anonymous. I don't remember anyone I met with. It was online. Yeah, so.
Thanks, Latifa.
Thank you.
Maria, and then
Yeah.
Jared, an opportunity to perhaps reflect on some questions around opportunities, just that you identified through this conversation, as well as how the citizens and the government can kind of work together to have a kind of equal playing field in this social media environment.
Is it on? Oh, yeah. Yeah, I think it's very important to ensure that, like, we see the reasons as to why they are shutting down the internet is disinformation, because it's going potential for causing violence. But I will argue that we have enough legislations and laws to counter the disinformation. So it's more harm in shutting down, because you'll ask yourself, why is disinformation happening? There's lack of transparency. People do not know what is happening. So I'd encourage, like, the government to utilize these spaces to share more information so that people know what is happening. People know how polls, counting of the ballots is happening. There's transparency around that. So how do we utilize social media to share that information? The other is, you mentioned the Kenyan experience. I was actually on the Twitter space when President Ruto was talking to the youth on space. I'd really encourage the government of Uganda to utilize those spaces and meet the citizens, so that citizens feel heard. Yes, we have the broadcaster where they come and then they talk to the people, but encourage a lot of that engagement with citizens through social media spaces, so that they can be heard and they feel like there's a bit of accountability and you're reporting on the progress that they're doing. So there's need for that, and I would really emphasize on not shutting down these spaces, because when you shut down those spaces, you create a vacuum where people don't feel heard or there's no engagement with the political or processes in Uganda.
Thank you. Jared?
Thank you, Maria. Again, thank you for the questions. I wanted to tie two together. I think the question on U.S. government policy, as well as leveling a playing field or coordinating between citizens and government. There are really two processes I want to highlight. One is multi-stakeholder coalitions. So often within countries, if there are different viewpoints between government and citizens, bringing in the business community, the private sector, bringing in other maybe religious communities, other stakeholders, attempts to broaden where the common good may be, and then that builds momentum for policy change or finding a success that everyone can get behind. Vis-a-vis U.S. policy and then norms on these platforms or in these spaces, there are many global multilateral mechanisms wherein Ugandan civil society, Ugandan government, activists around the world can actually feed into. So there's something called the Freedom Online Coalition, which is a state government representatives, and they work to recognize what are human rights, what are democratic values that can be ensconced and reinforced in democratic systems. So that's one global coalition. The UN has something called the Global Digital Compact, which gets reviewed at multi-stakeholder conventions like the Internet Governance Forum. These are all spaces where civil society is present at the table with tech companies, with governments, with the private sector, to actually have conversations about what norms look like through enforcement mechanisms globally, but also in national bodies. So I think there are a lot of different spaces for folks in the room, folks hoping to influence democratic outcomes in digital spaces to actually engage with. So I would raise those up.
Great, thank you so much. So with that, I'd like to conclude this presentation and thank both our network, the Southern Voices Network for Peacebuilding, who without that network of African policy institutions, think tanks, practitioners, and peace builders, none of this would actually be possible, as well as thanking the support from Carnegie Corporation of New York. I'd like to thank all of you who joined us online, as well as those in the room, and thank you to Jared and Maria for joining this panel, and of course, thank you to Latifa for all your hard work on this research and joining us here at the Wilson Center. It's been wonderful having you. So thank you very much.